The rustle of skirts against sawdust-strewn floorboards silenced the crowded auction house in Silver Creek, Colorado, as Penelope Montgomery stumbled forward, her cheeks flushing crimson against her porcelain skin. It was 1876, and the West was still wild enough that a woman's misstep could become fodder for cruel entertainment. Laughter erupted from the sea of weathered faces, but she held her chin high despite the humiliation burning in her chest. "Stand, miss. You're coming home with me." The deep voice cut through the jeers like a knife. Penelope's eyes darted up to find a tall figure extending a weathered hand toward her. His face was partially shadowed by the brim of his Stetson, but she could make out a strong jaw dusted with stubble and eyes the color of a summer storm. Gabriel Hawkins wasn't a man who frequented auctions, but fate had a curious way of putting people where they needed to be. He'd only come to town for supplies before heading back to his ranch, but something about the woman's quiet dignity amidst the mockery compelled him to step forward. "I don't need your charity, sir," Penelope whispered, attempting to regain her footing independently. Gabriel's expression remained steady. "It's not charity I'm offering, Miss Montgomery, it's respect, something sorely lacking in this establishment today." The whispers rippled through the crowd. Everyone in Silver Creek knew Gabriel Hawkins, owner of the Sunrise Ranch, widower of 2 years and a man who kept mostly to himself. To see him extend himself publicly for a woman, especially the newly arrived Penelope Montgomery, raised eyebrows and piqued curiosities. "How do you know my name?" she asked, finally accepting his hand and rising to her feet. "Small town," he replied simply. "Word travels when the schoolteacher's niece arrives from Boston." Penelope brushed the dust from her skirts, painfully aware of the eyes still watching them. Her aunt had warned her that Western territories were different from her Eastern upbringing, but she hadn't expected such open hostility for a simple misstep. "The auction isn't over, miss," called the auctioneer, a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose. "Your uncle's possessions are still to be sold." Penelope swallowed hard. That's why she'd come to retrieve something, anything, that belonged to her late uncle before strangers claimed all that remained of him. After her parents' deaths from influenza last winter, Uncle Thomas had been her only remaining family besides Aunt Martha. Now she stood alone, a newcomer in a town that already seemed determined to reject her. "I'm buying the lot," Gabriel announced, pulling a leather pouch from his coat. A collective gasp swept through the room. Penelope stared at him in disbelief. "Mr. Hawkins, there are 37 items catalogued," the auctioneer sputtered. "Name your price," Gabriel responded, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. The auctioneer named a sum that made Penelope's heart sink. It was more than she'd earned in 3 years of teaching. Without hesitation, Gabriel counted out the bills and handed them over. "Have it all delivered to my ranch by sundown," he instructed before turning to Penelope. "Miss Montgomery, would you allow me to escort you to your aunt's house?" Too stunned to speak, she merely nodded. As they stepped out into the harsh sunlight, whispers followed them down the boardwalk. "Why would you do that?" she finally asked when they were out of earshot. "You don't know me." Gabriel adjusted his hat against the sun's glare. "I knew your uncle. He was a good man who deserved better than having his life auctioned off for entertainment, and no lady deserves to be laughed at for an honest stumble." Penelope studied him, trying to reconcile this act of kindness with the reserved, almost intimidating figure he cut. "That's a substantial amount of money, Mr. Hawkins. Money's just paper unless it's put to good use." He offered his arm as they approached a muddy crossing. "Besides, I'm curious to see what Thomas Montgomery deemed worth keeping all these years." For the first time since arriving in Silver Creek, Penelope felt the tightness in her chest ease slightly. "I'd like to repay you somehow." Gabriel's eyes met hers, and something passed between them, an understanding, perhaps, or the seed of something neither was prepared to name. "Come to the ranch when the items arrive. Select what holds meaning for you. That'll be payment enough. And the rest?" she questioned. A rare smile crossed his face. "I could use some civilizing influence at Sunrise Ranch. Maybe your uncle's books and art might just do the trick." As they reached her aunt's modest home, Penelope felt the first stirrings of curiosity about this enigmatic man. "Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. I'll come by tomorrow if that suits." "Gabriel," he corrected, "and tomorrow would be fine, Miss Montgomery." "Penelope," she offered in return. He tipped his hat. "Until tomorrow, Penelope." As he walked away, Penelope couldn't help but wonder if her stumble at the auction might have been the first step towards something unexpected in this unfamiliar territory. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of pristine Colorado day that made the mountains seem close enough to touch. Penelope rose early, dressing carefully in her most practical skirt and blouse. She'd learned quickly that Eastern fashions were impractical for Western living. "You're going out to the Hawkins place alone?" Aunt Martha questioned over a simple breakfast of biscuits and preserves. "It's not proper, Penelope. He saved me from humiliation and purchased Uncle Thomas's belongings," Penelope reasoned. "I merely wish to thank him properly and perhaps recover some mementos." Martha pursed her lips. "Gabriel Hawkins is not a man to be taken lightly. Ever since Caroline died, he's kept to himself. People respect him, but they also know to give him wide berth." Penelope's curiosity deepened. "How did his wife die?" "Childbirth. Lost both her and the baby 2 years ago. He was different before that, more involved in town affairs," smiled Moore. Martha shook her head. "Now he runs that big ranch with just a few hands and rarely comes to town except for necessities." The information settled heavily on Penelope's heart. She understood loss intimately, the way it hollowed you out, left you wandering through life as a shell of who you once were. "I'll be back before supper," she promised, securing her hat with a pin. Martha sighed. "Take the mare. It's 5 miles to Sunrise Ranch and the stagecoach doesn't go that way." The ride gave Penelope time to think. She'd come west seeking a fresh start after losing her parents, hoping her uncle and aunt could provide stability. Finding her uncle already gone and her aunt barely managing had been a shock, but she was determined to make a life here. Teaching positions were scarce in Boston, especially for unmarried women approaching 25, but the Western Territories needed educated people. Sunrise Ranch appeared on the horizon like a painting, a sprawling main house of timber and stone, flanked by several outbuildings and corrals. Cattle dotted the distant pastures, and the mountains provided a majestic backdrop. It was beautiful in a rugged way that Boston could never match. As she approached, a young ranch hand rushed to greet her. "Miss Montgomery, Mr. Hawkins said to expect you. I'm Joey. Let me take your horse." She thanked him and allowed him to help her dismount. The main house door opened, and Gabriel emerged, dressed more casually than yesterday in a simple shirt, vest, and trousers. Without the formality of town clothing, he appeared younger but no less imposing. "You found your way without trouble," he called, crossing the yard to meet her. "The mayor knows the territory better than I do," she admitted with a small smile, his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. "Smart animals, horses, better judges of character than most people," he gestured toward the house. "Your uncle's things arrived last night. I had them placed in the study." Penelope followed him inside, immediately struck by the contrast between the rugged exterior and the unexpectedly refined interior. The furnishings were simple but of good quality, and everything was meticulously clean. This was not the bachelor dwelling she had anticipated. "Mrs. Talbot comes from town 3 times a week," Gabriel explained, noticing her surprise. "Caroline was particular about keeping a proper home. I've tried to maintain some semblance of that." The mention of his late wife lingered in the air between them as they entered the study. Crates and trunks were arranged neatly, some already opened. "I took the liberty of beginning to unpack," Gabriel said. "Hope you don't mind." "Of course not. It's more than generous that you've allowed me to claim anything at all." Penelope moved toward one of the open crates, her fingers trailing over a stack of leather-bound books. "Uncle Thomas loved his library. Aunt Martha couldn't bear to keep his books after he passed too many memories." Gabriel nodded, understanding evident in his expression. Loss changes the meaning of ordinary things. Penelope glanced up, meeting his gaze directly. "Yes, it does." She hesitated before adding, "My aunt mentioned your loss. I'm truly sorry." His jaw tightened momentarily. "Thank you." The words were simple, but the emotion behind them was complex. After a moment, he continued, "Take your time, I have some business to attend to with the foreman. When you've selected what you'd like, join me for lunch if you're amenable." Left alone, Penelope explored her uncle's possessions with reverence. She selected several books that held special meaning, a pocket watch that had belonged to her grandfather, and a small watercolor painting of the Boston harbor that reminded her of home. As she worked, she couldn't help noticing signs of Gabriel throughout the study, a half-finished ledger showing meticulous ranch accounts, a well-worn copy of Thoreau's Walden, sketches of horse breeding lineages. The door opened as she was examining a framed daguerreotype of her uncle as a young man. "Hungry?" Gabriel asked, standing in the doorway. Penelope nodded, carefully placing the items she'd chosen in a small pile. "These few things, if it's acceptable, they're mainly sentimental value." Gabriel gestured to the table in the dining room, where Mrs. Talbot had laid out a simple but hearty meal of roast beef, potatoes, and fresh bread. "Take whatever holds meaning. The rest can stay here until you decide what to do with it." Over lunch, the initial awkwardness between them gradually dissolved as they discovered shared interests in literature and a similar dry sense of humor. Gabriel spoke knowledgeably about cattle breeding and the challenges of ranching, while Penelope described her teaching experiences and ambitions. "You're different from what I expected," Gabriel admitted as they finished their meal. "How so?" she asked, genuinely curious. "Most Eastern women who come west are either desperately seeking husbands or running from something. You seem to have purpose beyond either." Penelope appreciated his directness. "I came west because teaching positions are more readily available and women are judged more on their capabilities than their marital status. Boston has strict ideas about spinster schoolteachers." Gabriel raised an eyebrow. "You consider yourself a spinster at what, 24? 25 next month," she corrected with a wry smile. "And in Boston, yes, practically condemned to spinsterhood. Here, I'm simply Miss Montgomery, the schoolteacher's niece. And what will you be once the school term begins?" Penelope sighed. "That remains uncertain. The school board hasn't decided if they'll offer me a position. They seem reluctant to hire someone with Eastern credentials." Gabriel studied her for a moment. "The head of the school board is Harold Jenkins. His wife Mabel is fond of preserves. Martha's raspberry jam might find its way to their table before the next meeting." Penelope laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that seemed to surprise them both. "Mr. Hawkins, are you suggesting bribery through preserves?" His eyes warmed. "I'm suggesting Western diplomacy, Miss Montgomery." As the afternoon waned, Penelope reluctantly prepared to leave. Gabriel insisted on escorting her back to town, citing the approaching storm clouds. They rode side by side, their conversation flowing more easily now. "I'd like to invite you and your aunt to Sunday dinner," Gabriel said as they neared town. "As a proper thank you for coming all this way." Penelope was touched by the gesture. "We would be delighted, though I feel it's I who should be thanking you." The first heavy raindrops began to fall as they reached Martha's house. Gabriel helped her quickly unload her uncle's belongings and saw her safely to the door. "Sunday at noon," he confirmed, rain plastering his hair to his forehead. Penelope impulsively touched his arm. "Thank you again for everything." Something shifted in his expression, a momentary vulnerability quickly masked. "Until Sunday, Penelope." As he rode away through the intensifying downpour, Penelope stood sheltered by the porch, wondering at the strange turn her life had taken since yesterday's humiliating stumble. The following weeks established a pattern that surprised both Penelope and the townspeople of Silver Creek. Gabriel, who had been a near recluse since his wife's death, began making regular appearances in town. Coincidentally, these visits often aligned with Penelope's errands or her walks home from the schoolhouse, where she had indeed secured a position teaching the younger children. Martha observed these developments with a mixture of concern and approval. "He's coming back to life," she remarked one evening as they prepared supper. "But I worry for both of you. Tongues are wagging, Penelope." Penelope continued peeling potatoes, her expression neutral. "People will talk regardless of what one does. I consider Mr. Hawkins a friend. A friend who rides 10 miles round trip just to walk you home from school. Martha's tone was gentle but knowing. A friend who's renovating his wife's garden for the first time in 2 years. Heat rose to Penelope's cheeks. The garden is for practical purposes. He mentioned wanting fresh vegetables without relying on town supplies. Martha simply hummed knowingly and returned to her biscuit dough. The truth was more complicated than Penelope cared to admit. In Gabriel, she had found not just friendship but intellectual companionship that had been lacking in her life. Their discussions ranged from literature to philosophy, from teaching methods to ranching techniques. He listened to her ideas with genuine interest and respected her opinions even when they differed from his own. For his part, Gabriel found himself looking forward to their conversations in a way that both exhilarated and terrified him. Since Caroline's death, he had carefully constructed a life of routine and solitude, finding comfort in its predictability. Penelope challenged that comfort, bringing color into his grayscale existence. One warm afternoon in late May, Gabriel arrived at the schoolhouse just as Penelope was dismissing her students. The children had grown accustomed to his presence and called cheerful goodbyes as they scattered toward their homes. "How was your day?" he asked, falling into step beside her. "Eventful. Billy Matthews brought a garden snake for show and tell without warning me first." Her eyes danced with amusement. "Poor Sarah Wilson nearly fainted," Gabriel chuckled. "And how did the teacher handle this crisis?" "With remarkable composure, I'll have you know." I calmly explained that while educational, living specimens require prior approval and proper containment. Penelope adjusted her book bag on her shoulder. Then I made him release it behind the schoolhouse while the girls watched from the window. Their laughter mingled in the afternoon sun. As they walked past the general store, Penelope noticed Martha engaged in conversation with Mrs. Jenkins. Her aunt nodded in their direction, prompting Mrs. Jenkins to turn and observe them with undisguised curiosity. "The town's fascination with our friendship shows no sign of waning," Penelope noted, Gabriel's expression sobered. "Does it bother you?" She considered the question honestly. "Sometimes, not the attention itself, but the assumptions behind it. As if a man and woman can't simply enjoy each other's company without romantic intentions." Something flickered across Gabriel's face, a momentary shadow. And if there were such intentions, would that be unwelcome? The directness of the question caught her off guard. They had carefully maintained the boundaries of friendship despite the obvious connection between them. Neither had addressed the growing tension that sometimes arose in moments of silence or accidental touches. Penelope began, then hesitated. "I value our friendship too much to risk it on assumptions." Gabriel stopped walking, turning to face her fully. They stood in the shade of a large oak tree partially sheltered from curious eyes. "It's not an assumption," he said quietly. "It's a question, Penelope." "One I've been avoiding for weeks." Her heart quickened. "What question is that?" "Whether you might consider allowing our friendship to become something more." His voice remained steady, but she could see the cost of that control in the tension around his eyes. "I didn't expect to feel this way again. After Caroline, I thought that part of my life was over." Penelope swallowed hard, her own emotions a turbulent mix of joy and apprehension. "Gabriel, you don't need to answer now," he interjected. "Just know that my intentions are honorable, and regardless of your answer, I value your friendship above all else." Before she could formulate a response, a commotion from the direction of the saloon drew their attention. A group of ranch hands from the neighboring property, clearly intoxicated despite the early hour, were harassing a young woman trying to deliver laundry. Gabriel's expression darkened. "Excuse me," he said to Penelope before striding purposefully toward the scene. Penelope watched as he calmly but firmly intervened, his presence alone enough to make the men reconsider their behavior. It wasn't the first time she'd witnessed his quiet authority and sense of justice, qualities that had increasingly drawn her to him. As Gabriel escorted the grateful young woman safely to her destination, Penelope acknowledged the truth she'd been avoiding. She was falling in love with Gabriel Hawkins. The realization wasn't a sudden epiphany, but rather the recognition of something that had been growing steadily, like the wildflowers that bloomed across the meadows after spring rains gradually, persistently, inevitably. When Gabriel returned, she met his gaze with newfound clarity. "I'd like to continue our conversation," she said. "Perhaps tomorrow, at the ranch." Relief and hope crossed his features. "I'll send Joey to collect you after school." That evening, Penelope confided in her aunt about Gabriel's declaration and her decision to visit him privately the next day. Martha sighed deeply. "I suspected this was coming. You understand people will talk even more now." "They already do," Penelope pointed out. "I can't base my decisions on town gossip." "It's not just gossip I'm concerned about." Martha set aside her knitting. "Gabriel Hawkins is a good man, but he carries deep wounds. Caroline's death nearly destroyed him. Are you prepared for what loving him might entail?" Penelope considered her aunt's words carefully. "I can't promise to heal him, nor would I presume to try. But I believe we might find something meaningful together if we're both willing to risk it." Martha studied her niece's determined expression. "You've changed since coming west, Penelope. There's a strength in you now that wasn't as evident before." "Perhaps I'm simply becoming who I was meant to be," she replied softly. The next day passed in a blur of anticipation. When Joey arrived with the wagon after school, Penelope was ready, having changed into a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes. The ride to Sunrise Ranch seemed both interminable and too brief. As they approached, Penelope saw Gabriel waiting on the porch, standing straighter than usual, his customary hat absent. He'd clearly made an effort with his appearance, wearing a clean white shirt and his best vest. Joey helped her down from the wagon with a knowing grin before tactfully making himself scarce. Gabriel met her at the bottom of the steps, uncertainty and hope warring in his expression. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he admitted. "I said I would," she replied simply. They walked toward the garden Gabriel had been reviving, now showing the first signs of new growth. Tomato plants stretched toward the sun, and bean vines curled around their stakes with verdant enthusiasm. "Caroline loved gardening," Gabriel said after a moment. "She said it was like faith planting something tiny and believing it would become something sustaining." Penelope appreciated his willingness to speak of his wife. "She sounds like a remarkable woman." She was. His voice held fondness without the raw pain that had been present months earlier. "It took me a long time to understand that honoring her memory didn't mean living half a life." They stopped beside a newly installed bench overlooking both the garden and the distant mountains. As they sat, Penelope gathered her courage. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," she began. "About our friendship becoming something more." Gabriel waited, giving her space to continue. "I care for you, Gabriel, more than I intended to, more than perhaps is wise." She met his gaze directly. "But I need to know, is it me you see when you look at me? Not a replacement or a second chance, but Penelope Montgomery with all her faults and strengths." The question hung between them, weighted with importance. Gabriel considered her words carefully. "When Caroline died, I thought a part of me died too. I functioned, I worked, I existed, but I wasn't living. Then you stumbled at that auction and something woke up inside me." He took her hand gently. "What I feel for you isn't a continuation or a replacement. It's entirely new, entirely its own." He paused, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "You're nothing like Caroline. She was gentle, always agreeable, raised to be a rancher's wife. You challenge me, argue with me, introduce ideas that never would have occurred to me. You're stubborn and principled and occasionally infuriating." A surprised laugh escaped Penelope. "This is your declaration of affection," his eyes warmed. "It is, because I see you, Penelope Montgomery, and what I see makes me want to be a better man." The simple honesty of his words touched her deeply. "I see you too, Gabriel Hawkins." "The good and the difficult parts," and he prompted, "and I would like to see where this path leads us." She squeezed his hand. Slowly, with care for both our hearts, relief and joy transformed his face. Gently, he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles with such reverence that Penelope felt it throughout her body. "I can be patient," he promised. They spent the remainder of the afternoon planning the garden's expansion, discussing books they both enjoyed, and sharing stories from their pasts. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, Gabriel reluctantly mentioned that they should start back to town. "Would you join me for the Founders' Day celebration next Saturday?" he asked as they walked toward the waiting wagon. "As my companion, officially." Penelope understood the significance of the request. Appearing together at the town's biggest annual event would make their courtship public knowledge. "I would be honored," she replied, knowing that this simple answer was committing to much more than a single evening. The week leading up to Founders' Day buzzed with preparations and anticipation. Martha helped Penelope refresh her best dress, adding new ribbons and adjusting the fit to flatter her figure. Meanwhile, rumors of Gabriel Hawkins' intention to court the schoolteacher spread through Silver Creek like wildfire. Most reactions were positive. Gabriel was respected, and Penelope had proven herself a dedicated teacher. A few disapproving murmurs came from those who thought it too soon after Caroline's passing, or those who had harbored hopes for themselves or their daughters. One voice in particular grew increasingly bitter. Victor Ransom, owner of the neighboring ranch and longtime business rival of Gabriel, made his displeasure known loudly in the saloon. Barely 2 years since he buried his wife and already replacing her with that Eastern schoolmarm, he sneered to anyone who would listen. Always thought Hawkins was too quick to move on from setbacks. These comments eventually reached Gabriel through his ranch hands. Though he dismissed them publicly, privately they stirred his doubts. Was he dishonoring Caroline's memory? Was he rushing into something new because he couldn't bear the emptiness? The morning of Founders' Day, Gabriel rode into town early, ostensibly to help with setup but actually seeking guidance. He found Pastor Miller arranging tables in the churchyard. "Got a moment, Pastor?" Gabriel asked, helping to straighten a heavy table. The older man studied Gabriel's troubled expression. "For you always. What's weighing on you, son?" They moved to the relative privacy of the church porch. Gabriel removed his hat, turning it nervously in his hands. "I've begun courting Miss Montgomery." Pastor Miller nodded. "So I've heard." "She's a fine woman." "She is," Gabriel agreed, "but I'm questioning my motivations. Caroline's only been gone 2 years. The pastor considered his response carefully. "Grief doesn't operate on a timetable, Gabriel. Some mourn for decades, others find their hearts opening sooner. It doesn't diminish what came before." "How do I know I'm not just trying to fill the emptiness?" Gabriel pressed. "Is that what it feels like, a filling of emptiness?" Gabriel thought about how he felt in Penelope's presence, not completed or healed, but challenged and enlivened in ways both familiar and entirely new. "No," he finally said. "It feels like growth, like something unexpected taking root." Pastor Miller smiled gently. "Then perhaps your heart is wiser than your doubts. Caroline wanted you to be happy, Gabriel. She told me so herself in those final days." The confirmation stunned Gabriel. "She did," her exact words were, "make sure he doesn't use me as an excuse to stop living." The pastor placed a comforting hand on Gabriel's shoulder. "Living fully honors her memory more than any monument ever could." The conversation settled something in Gabriel. By the time he called for Penelope that evening, his doubts had transformed into a quiet certainty. Penelope opened the door wearing a dress of deep green that complemented her auburn hair, which was styled more elaborately than usual. Gabriel momentarily forgot his carefully prepared compliments. "You're beautiful," he said simply, her cheeks colored slightly. "Thank you." "You're quite handsome yourself." Martha appeared behind her niece. "Have her home at a reasonable hour, Gabriel. Even courting couples need proper rest." "Yes, madam," he promised with a smile, offering Penelope his arm. The town square was transformed for Founders' Day, with lanterns strung between buildings, tables laden with food, and a platform erected for dancing. As they entered together, conversations momentarily paused and heads turned in their direction. Gabriel felt Penelope tense slightly beside him. "Second thoughts," he murmured. She straightened her shoulders. "Not one. They moved through the crowd, greeting townspeople and accepting both warm wishes and curious stares with equal grace. Mayor Williams approached them, his wife hovering anxiously at his side. Hawkins. Good to see you participating again. He pumped Gabriel's hand enthusiastically before turning to Penelope. Miss Montgomery, you've certainly brought our local rancher back into society. Well done. Gabriel bristled slightly at the implication that Penelope was merely a social influence, but she responded with polite diplomacy. Mr. Hawkins has always been an engaged citizen, Mayor. I'm simply fortunate to enjoy his company. The evening progressed pleasantly. They shared a meal at one of the long tables, danced several sets together, Gabriel proving surprisingly adept despite his claims of rustiness, and enjoyed conversations with various townspeople. Throughout it all, Gabriel remained attentive, his hand often finding the small of her back or her elbow in gestures that were both protective and affectionate. As the celebration continued, Victor Ransom appeared, already showing signs of having visited the whiskey barrel too frequently. He approached their table with a false smile. Well, if it isn't Silver Creek's newest couple, he drawled. Miss Montgomery, you've certainly worked fast since arriving in our little town. Gabriel tensed, but Penelope laid a restraining hand on his arm. Mr. Ransom, I believe you're needed at the punch table, she said pleasantly. Your wife appears to be looking for you. Victor glanced over his shoulder to see his wife indeed gesturing impatiently for him. With a scowl, he retreated, but not without a parting shot. Careful, schoolteacher. Hawkins has a habit of losing the women in his life. Gabriel half rose, but Penelope's grip tightened. He's not worth it, she murmured, and he's hoping to cause a scene. Slowly, Gabriel settled back into his seat, though his jaw remained tight. I apologize for that. Ransom and I have a complicated history. You don't need to apologize for others' poor behavior. Penelope studied his face in the lantern light, but perhaps we could take a brief walk. The air would be refreshing. They strolled toward the edge of the celebration, finding a quiet spot near the churchyard. The distant music and laughter created a pleasant backdrop as they gazed up at the star-filled sky. I spoke with Pastor Miller this morning, Gabriel said after a moment, about us. Penelope turned to him questioningly. I needed to reconcile some things in my own mind, about Caroline, about moving forward. He took her hands in his. I wanted to be certain I was courting you for the right reasons. And what did you conclude? She asked softly. That what I feel for you is real and true, entirely its own, that Caroline would approve. His voice grew husky with emotion. That I'm falling in love with you, Penelope Montgomery, and it terrifies and exhilarates me in equal measure. The declaration hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable. Penelope's eyes shimmered in the distant lantern light. I'm falling in love with you too, she whispered. And it terrifies me as well, but not enough to stop. Gabriel's hand gently cupped her cheek. May I kiss you, Penelope? Her answer was to lean forward slightly, permission granted in the tilt of her face toward his. Their first kiss was gentle and brief, a tender promise rather than a passionate claim. When they parted, Gabriel rested his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in the cool evening air. We should return to the celebration, Penelope said eventually, though reluctance colored her tone. Gabriel nodded, offering his arm once more. As they walked back toward the lights and music, Penelope leaned slightly closer. Perhaps we could visit your ranch tomorrow. I'd like to continue our discussion about expanding the garden. The seemingly innocent suggestion carried deeper meaning that Gabriel easily understood. They were planning a future, planting seeds of possibility together. I'd like that very much, he replied, his heart lighter than it had been in years. The weeks following Founders' Day established Gabriel and Penelope as Silver Creek's most discussed couple. Their courtship proceeded with proper decorum but unmistakable affection. Gabriel came to town several times a week, often attending church services beside Penelope and dining with her and Martha afterward. Penelope, in turn, spent many weekends at Sunrise Ranch, helping with the expanding garden and discussing improvements to the main house. As summer stretched into autumn, Martha observed the deepening relationship with mixed emotions. One evening in late September, as Penelope returned from yet another day at the ranch, her aunt broached the subject directly. "He'll ask you to marry him soon," Martha stated as they prepared for bed. Penelope paused in brushing her hair. "What makes you say that? I've seen the way he looks at you, and he asked me yesterday if I would mind terribly living alone." Surprise and joy flickered across Penelope's face. "He spoke to you about marriage, not directly," Martha admitted. "But he was certainly testing the waters." She sat on the edge of Penelope's bed. "Are you prepared for what marriage to Gabriel will mean? Living on a remote ranch, possibly raising children far from proper medical care, taking on the responsibility of a large household." Penelope set down her hairbrush. "I've considered all of those things. I love teaching, but I can teach our children and perhaps others in the area who can't reach town easily. As for the remoteness," she smiled softly, "I find I prefer the quiet of Sunrise Ranch to town most days." Martha studied her niece's serene expression. "You've changed since coming here." "For the better, I hope." "Yes," Martha confirmed. "You've found your strength and your heart." The anticipated proposal came the following weekend during a picnic by the creek that ran through Gabriel's property. They had spent the morning riding the boundaries of the ranch, Gabriel proudly showing Penelope recent improvements and discussing future plans. Now they rested in the shade of cottonwood trees, the remains of their lunch packed away, comfortable silence between them. "I've been thinking," Gabriel began, idly twisting a stem of grass between his fingers. Penelope smiled. "A dangerous pastime, I'm told. Indeed." He returned her smile briefly before his expression grew more serious. "I've been thinking about the future, our future." Her heart quickened, but she remained outwardly calm. "What conclusions have you reached?" Gabriel shifted to face her more directly. "That I want to build that future with you, here at Sunrise Ranch if you're willing." "Are you asking me something specific, Mr. Hawkins?" Penelope's tone was teasing, but her eyes reflected the gravity of the moment. With deliberate movements, Gabriel reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. From it, he produced a ring, a delicate band of gold set with a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. "I am indeed asking something very specific, Miss Montgomery." He took her hand gently. "I'm asking if you would do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife." Though she had anticipated this moment, the reality of it, Gabriel kneeling before her, offering his heart and future, brought tears to her eyes. "I would be deeply honored to become your wife," she answered, her voice steady despite her emotion. Gabriel's face transformed with joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, catching the afternoon sunlight in brilliant flashes. "It was my grandmother's," he explained. "My mother gave it to me before she passed, saying it should go to the woman who brought light back into my life." Penelope examined the ring with wonder. "It's beautiful and meaningful coming from your family." "There's something else," Gabriel said, reaching for her other hand. "I want you to know that while I hope for a family together, I understand the risks." After Caroline, he swallowed hard. "I won't risk losing you. If you prefer not to have children, I would understand." The honesty of his statement moved her deeply. "Oh, Gabriel," she squeezed his hands. "I do want children, our children, but I appreciate your concern. Perhaps Dr. Simmons in Denver might have more modern approaches than we have locally." Relief crossed his features. "We'll consult him then, take every precaution." They sealed their agreement with a kiss that held both promise and passion. As they rode back to the ranch house, plans already forming for their future, neither noticed the lone figure watching from the distant tree line, Victor Ransom, his expression darkening as he observed their evident happiness. Word of Gabriel and Penelope's engagement spread quickly through Silver Creek. Congratulations poured in from most quarters, along with the inevitable questions about wedding dates and living arrangements. "I'd like to finish the school term," Penelope explained to Martha as they discussed timing. "That would mean a December wedding." "Winter weddings can be beautiful," Martha agreed, "and it gives us adequate time to prepare, though I imagine Gabriel would prefer sooner rather than later." Penelope blushed slightly. "He's been very understanding about my commitment to the children." The following Sunday, after church services, Pastor Miller officially announced their engagement to the congregation. A small celebration followed, with ladies eagerly discussing wedding preparations and men slapping Gabriel on the back in congratulation. Amidst the well-wishers, Harold Jenkins, head of the school board, approached Penelope with a concerned expression. "Miss Montgomery, while we certainly wish you every happiness, this does present a complication for the school." Penelope had anticipated this conversation. "Mr. Jenkins, I intend to complete the term as promised. As for next year, I would hope the board might consider allowing me to continue teaching, even as Mrs. Hawkins." Jenkins frowned. "It's most irregular. Married women rarely continue teaching." "Perhaps in the East," Gabriel interjected, joining the conversation. "But surely Western territories might be more progressive. After all, qualified teachers are scarce here." The suggestion of Silver Creek being progressive clearly appealed to Jenkins' civic pride. "Well, it would require board discussion, of course, but perhaps some arrangement might be possible." As Jenkins moved away, Penelope squeezed Gabriel's hand gratefully. "Thank you for supporting me in this." "Always," he replied simply. "Your teaching is part of who you are. I wouldn't ask you to abandon it entirely." Their happiness, however, was not universally celebrated. Victor Ransom's resentment festered, fueled by both personal grudges against Gabriel and his own failing marriage. That very afternoon, while the engagement celebration continued at the church, Victor nursed his grievances in the saloon. "Hawkins thinks he's better than everyone," he muttered to the bartender. "Now he's marrying that fancy Eastern schoolteacher, but she doesn't know half the things he's done." The bartender, accustomed to Victor's bitter monologues, merely wiped glasses disinterestedly. "Mark my words," Victor continued, "something will happen to her too, just like Caroline, just like that deal with my father's land. Hawkins doesn't hold on to good things." As autumn progressed, preparations for the December wedding occupied much of Penelope's free time. Gabriel, meanwhile, focused on readying the ranch house for his bride. He had the master bedroom repainted, ordered new furnishings from Denver, and began construction on a small schoolroom addition where Penelope could continue teaching local children. One crisp October afternoon, Penelope arrived at Sunrise Ranch to find Gabriel in deep conversation with a stranger, a distinguished-looking gentleman in city clothes. "Penelope," Gabriel called, beckoning her over. "I'd like you to meet Dr. James Simmons from Denver, Dr. Simmons, my fiancée, Miss Penelope Montgomery." The doctor bowed slightly. "A pleasure, Miss Montgomery. Mr. Hawkins speaks very highly of you." Penelope glanced questioningly at Gabriel, who explained, "I wrote to Dr. Simmons about our concerns. He happened to be traveling to Silver Creek on other business and kindly agreed to consult with us." Understanding dawned. Gabriel had been true to his word about seeking modern medical advice. "That's wonderful," she said sincerely. "Thank you for coming, doctor." They spent an hour in private consultation, with Dr. Simmons providing both reassurance and practical advice about pregnancy and childbirth. His progressive approaches and willingness to discuss such matters openly with a woman impressed Penelope greatly. "I maintain a regular circuit through this region," Dr. Simmons explained as their meeting concluded. "I can ensure I'm never more than a day's ride away during your confinement when that time comes." After the doctor departed, Penelope embraced Gabriel warmly. "Thank you for arranging that. It means a great deal that you took our concerns so seriously." Gabriel held her close. "Your health and happiness are my highest priorities, Penelope, always." Their wedding date was set for December 18th. Allowing for the school term to end and giving Martha sufficient time to help prepare Penelope's trousseau. The entire town seemed involved in the preparations, with ladies organizing quilting bees for wedding gifts and men offering to help with last-minute ranch projects. As the wedding approached, however, Victor Ransom's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He made vague accusations against Gabriel in public places, though most townspeople dismissed them as the ravings of a jealous, bitter man. Gabriel attempted to ignore the provocations, focusing instead on his future with Penelope. 2 weeks before the wedding, disaster struck. Penelope had stayed late at the schoolhouse, preparing end-of-term assessments when she noticed an unusual smell. Moments later, she saw smoke curling from beneath the door to the supply closet. Fire. She ran to the door, only to find it hot to the touch and already blocked by flames. Quickly, she moved to the windows, but discovered to her horror that they had been nailed shut from the outside. Panic threatened to overwhelm her as smoke filled the schoolroom, but she forced herself to remain calm. Using a heavy dictionary, she broke one of the windows and called for help as loudly as she could. The smithy's apprentice, passing nearby, heard her cries and immediately ran for assistance. By the time Gabriel arrived with other townsmen, the fire had engulfed most of the building. They managed to break through the remaining windows and pull Penelope to safety just before the roof collapsed. Gabriel held her trembling form as Dr. Wilson examined her for injuries. She had suffered some smoke inhalation and minor cuts from the broken glass, but was otherwise unharmed. "Someone set this fire deliberately," Sheriff Taylor declared after a preliminary investigation. "And those windows were nailed shut from outside. This wasn't an accident." Gabriel's face hardened with fury and fear. Who would do such a thing? No one spoke the obvious suspicion aloud, but many eyes turned toward the saloon, where Victor Ransom had been drinking heavily all afternoon. "I want guards at Martha's house tonight," Gabriel instructed. "And I'm taking Penelope to the ranch where I can protect her." Martha agreed without hesitation, quickly packing necessities while Gabriel arranged for protection. By nightfall, Penelope was installed at Sunrise Ranch, still shaken but increasingly angry about the attack. "It has to be Victor," she said as Gabriel built up the fire in the study. "But why? What have I ever done to him?" Gabriel's expression was grim. "It's not about you, it's about me. Victor blames me for his father losing their original ranch 20 years ago." Penelope waited for him to continue. There was a drought. Many ranchers were struggling. "Old man Ransom borrowed heavily against his property but couldn't repay the bank. My father purchased the debt and foreclosed when payments stopped completely." Gabriel sighed heavily. "It was business, not personal, but Victor never saw it that way. When my father died and I inherited everything, Victor's resentment transferred to me. That explains his animosity toward you, but not an attempt on my life," Penelope reasoned. Gabriel's hands clenched. "He's trying to take from me what he believes I took from his family, everything that matters." The following morning, Sheriff Taylor rode out to Sunrise Ranch with troubling news. He had questioned Victor about his whereabouts during the fire, but the man had a solid alibi. He had been meeting with cattle buyers in full view of several witnesses. "So it wasn't him?" Penelope asked, confused. "I didn't say that," the sheriff clarified. "I said he wasn't physically there, but Victor has 2 ranch hands who are unquestioningly loyal to him. Neither can account for their whereabouts yesterday afternoon." Gabriel paced the study. "You think he ordered it done? It's possible. But proving it?" Sheriff Taylor shook his head. "Without a confession or witness, it's just speculation." After the sheriff departed, Gabriel turned to Penelope with determination. "We're moving up the wedding. I want you here where I can protect you as soon as possible." Penelope considered arguing but recognized the logic in his proposal. "What about the school term?" "The building is gone, Penelope. The term is effectively over." His expression softened as he took her hands. "Marry me this Sunday. We'll have a simple ceremony with just close friends. Later, when this danger has passed, we can have a larger celebration if you wish." After discussion with Martha, who was brought to the ranch for safety, they agreed. Pastor Miller was consulted and readily agreed to perform the ceremony at Sunrise Ranch rather than the church. Word was quietly spread to trusted friends, and preparations began for the hastened wedding. Despite the circumstances, Penelope found herself filled with anticipation rather than fear. The idea of becoming Gabriel's wife, of truly beginning their life together, overshadowed the threat that had precipitated the change in plans. Sunday dawned clear and cold, with fresh snow blanketing the landscape in pristine white. Martha helped Penelope dress in the wedding gown. They had been preparing ivory silk with delicate lace accents, simpler than originally planned but beautiful nonetheless. Her auburn hair was arranged in an elegant upswept style, adorned with small white flowers from Gabriel's greenhouse. The ceremony took place in the ranch house's large front parlor, decorated with evergreen boughs and white ribbons. A small group of their closest friends witnessed as Penelope and Gabriel exchanged vows before Pastor Miller, their voices clear and certain despite the circumstances that had hastened their union. I, Gabriel James Hawkins, take you, Penelope Ann Montgomery, to be my lawfully wedded wife. Gabriel's voice resonated with emotion as he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger to join her engagement ring. To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part. Penelope's eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she repeated the vows, her hands steady as she placed a matching band on Gabriel's finger. By the authority vested in me, Pastor Miller proclaimed, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride. Gabriel's kiss was tender yet passionate, a promise of the life they would build together despite all obstacles. As they turned to face their friends as Mr. and Mrs. Hawkins, spontaneous applause filled the room. The celebration that followed was modest but joyful. Mrs. Talbot had prepared an impressive wedding feast, and Joey had organized the ranch hands to provide music for dancing. As afternoon turned to evening, the newlyweds thanked their guests, who departed with final congratulations and well wishes. When the last guest had gone, Gabriel turned to Penelope with a mixture of love and concern. Are you happy, Mrs. Hawkins? Despite everything, Penelope leaned into his embrace. Immensely happy, Mr. Hawkins. This may not have been the wedding we planned, but it was perfect nonetheless. Later that night, as Penelope lay beside her husband in the master bedroom that was now hers as well, she reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment. From that humiliating stumble at the auction to becoming mistress of Sunrise Ranch, her life had transformed in ways she could never have imagined when she first arrived in Silver Creek. What are you thinking? Gabriel asked softly, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. That sometimes the most unexpected beginnings lead to the most perfect endings, she replied, turning in his arms to kiss him. Or rather, the most perfect beginnings. Their first weeks of marriage passed in a blissful haze despite the shadow of Victor Ransom's unresolved threat. Gabriel increased security at the ranch, employing additional hands and establishing regular patrols of the property boundaries. Penelope, meanwhile, began making Sunrise Ranch truly her home, reorganizing the household, establishing her own routines, and planning the garden expansion for spring. Christmas arrived, bringing with it a fresh blanket of snow and a renewed sense of hope. Gabriel surprised Penelope with a magnificent piano delivered from Denver, while she presented him with a finely crafted saddle she had secretly commissioned months earlier. I never thought I could be this happy again, Gabriel confessed as they sat before the fire Christmas night, enjoying mulled cider and each other's company. You've brought light back into my life, Penelope. She leaned against him contentedly. And you've given me a home and purpose I never expected to find. January brought harsh weather that temporarily isolated the ranch, but the newlyweds scarcely minded the enforced seclusion. They spent long evenings reading aloud to each other, playing chess, and planning for the future. During the days, Gabriel attended to ranch business while Penelope organized the small schoolroom addition, preparing to welcome neighboring children once the weather improved. By February, the threat from Victor seemed to have subsided. Sheriff Taylor reported that the man had been unusually subdued, focusing on his own ranch and showing little interest in the Hawkins family. Gabriel remained cautious but allowed himself to hope that perhaps Victor had finally moved past his vendetta. One crisp morning in early March, as the first signs of spring began to appear, Penelope awoke feeling unusually tired and slightly nauseated. The symptoms persisted for several days before Gabriel insisted she see Dr. Wilson during his monthly circuit through the area. The doctor's examination confirmed what Penelope had begun to suspect. She was expecting their first child, likely due in late October, Gabriel received the news with a complex mixture of joy and fear. "Are you certain you're well?" he asked repeatedly, remembering all too vividly Caroline's difficult pregnancy and tragic outcome. "Perfectly well," Penelope assured him, touched by his concern. "Dr. Wilson says I'm in excellent health and he'll consult with Dr. Simmons about my care." Gradually, Gabriel's fears gave way to cautious excitement. He threw himself into preparations, ordering books on childcare from back east, planning modifications to one of the bedrooms for a nursery, and insisting that Penelope rest far more than she deemed necessary. "At this rate, you'll have me bedridden by July," she teased one evening as he brought her tea and insisted on adjusting her pillows. "Is it so wrong to want to take care of you both?" he asked, his hand gently resting on her still flat stomach. She covered his hand with her own. "Not wrong at all, just perhaps a bit excessive when I'm perfectly capable of pouring my own tea." As spring progressed, Penelope began teaching in the newly completed schoolroom. 6 children from neighboring ranches attended 3 days a week, their parents grateful for the opportunity that saved them the long journey to town. Gabriel often found excuses to look in on these lessons, his heart swelling with pride as he watched his wife guide young minds with patience and enthusiasm. By late May, Penelope's condition was becoming visible, prompting a flurry of gifts and advice from the women of Silver Creek. Martha visited regularly, bringing hand-knitted baby clothes and practical wisdom about childbirth and infant care. Life settled into a pleasant rhythm, with the threat of Victor ransom increasingly fading from their minds. Then, in early June, the calm was shattered. Gabriel was inspecting fence lines with 2 ranch hands when they discovered 3 of their best breeding cattle dead not from disease or natural causes, but from gunshot wounds. Nearby, a crude message had been carved into a fence post. "This is just the beginning." The threat could not be ignored. Sheriff Taylor was summoned, evidence examined, and patrols doubled. Yet despite all precautions, incidents continued. A small barn fire quickly extinguished, poisoned feed that sickened several horses, threatening notes left where only ranch hands would find them. "It has to be Victor," Gabriel insisted during a tense meeting with the sheriff. "Who else bears me such ill will?" Sheriff Taylor looked troubled. "I've questioned him repeatedly. He has alibis for most of these incidents, and there's simply no evidence connecting him directly." "He's using his men," Gabriel argued, "or hiring others." "Possibly, but without proof." The sheriff sighed heavily. "I've sent for a federal marshal. This goes beyond local disturbances now." Gabriel's concern for Penelope, now 5 months pregnant, increased exponentially. He rarely left her side, delegating ranch work to trusted hands and installing additional locks on all doors and windows. The carefree happiness of their early marriage was temporarily overshadowed by vigilance and worry. Penelope bore these restrictions with understanding but refused to live in fear. "We cannot allow Victor to dictate how we live our lives," she insisted. "I won't be a prisoner in my own home." "I nearly lost you once," Gabriel reminded her. "I won't risk it again, especially not now." Their first serious disagreement as a married couple ensued, with Penelope arguing for normalcy and Gabriel for caution. Eventually, they reached a compromise. Penelope would continue teaching and maintain her household duties, but always with someone trustworthy nearby, and she would not travel to town without Gabriel. The marshal arrived in late June, a weathered, taciturn man named Caldwell with a reputation for thoroughness. He established himself in Silver Creek and began a methodical investigation, interviewing everyone connected to both the Hawkins and Ransom ranches. After 2 weeks of investigation, Marshal Caldwell rode out to Sunrise Ranch with significant news. "I believe we've identified your saboteur," he announced without preamble. "But it's not Victor Ransom, at least, not directly." Gabriel and Penelope exchanged surprised glances. "One of your own hands has been working against you," the marshal continued. "James Decker. He worked for Ransom 3 years ago before coming to you and apparently maintained that loyalty." Gabriel's expression hardened. "Decker, but he's been with us for years, since before." He trailed off, a terrible suspicion forming. Marshal Caldwell nodded grimly. Yes, since before your first wife's death. The implication hung heavily in the air, are you suggesting? Penelope began, unable to complete the terrible thought. I'm not suggesting anything yet, the marshal clarified, but I'd like to question him about both current events and past ones. Decker, however, had vanished absent from the bunkhouse that morning without explanation. A search of his few possessions revealed a damning collection of items. A letter from Victor Ransom promising payment for services rendered, crude drawings of the ranch layout with vulnerable points marked, and most disturbingly, a small vial of a substance Marshal Caldwell suspected was poison. We need to find him, Gabriel stated, fear and fury warring in his expression. If he was responsible for Caroline's death, we'll find him, Marshal Caldwell promised. I've already sent riders in all directions. He can't have gone far. For 3 days, the search continued without success. Gabriel barely slept, dividing his time between protecting Penelope and coordinating search parties. Penelope, despite her advancing pregnancy, remained calm and focused, providing support to Gabriel and maintaining household routines to create some semblance of normalcy. On the 4th day, as Gabriel conferred with the marshal in the study, a scream from the kitchen shattered the tense quiet. They rushed in to find Mrs. Talbot backed against the stove, pointing shakily toward the pantry door. He's in there. I saw him slip in. Marshal Caldwell drew his weapon, motioning Gabriel back. Get your wife to safety. Now, Gabriel hesitated only briefly before escorting Penelope and Mrs. Talbot from the kitchen. Once they were secured in the study, he grabbed his rifle and returned to find the marshal cautiously approaching the pantry. Decker, Caldwell called. Come out slowly with your hands visible. Silence greeted his command. With a nod to Gabriel, the marshal yanked open the pantry door, weapon raised. The small space appeared empty at first glance, until a movement from above caught their attention. Decker had wedged himself near the ceiling, balanced precariously on shelving. It's over, Decker, Gabriel stated coldly. Come down before you force us to shoot. The man's face twisted with hatred. Nothing's over. You don't deserve any of this, Hawkins. Not the ranch, not happiness, nothing. Was it you? Gabriel demanded, his voice dangerously controlled. Did you poison Caroline? A malicious smile spread across Decker's face. Ransom paid well for that job, said if Hawkins lost his wife and child, he'd know how it felt to lose everything. Took months of slipping that stuff into her tea before it worked. The confession, delivered with such callous satisfaction, nearly broke Gabriel's control. His finger tightened on the trigger, but Marshal Caldwell's steady voice intervened. That's murder, Decker, premeditated. You'll hang for it. Not if I take Hawkins with me. Decker suddenly lunged from his perch, a concealed knife flashing in his hand as he aimed directly for Gabriel's chest. 2 shots rang out simultaneously, Gabriel's rifle and the marshal's revolver. Decker collapsed mid-leap, dead before he hit the floor, his knife clattering harmlessly aside. The aftermath was a blur of activity. Sheriff Taylor arriving, statements being taken, Decker's body removed. Through it all, Gabriel moved mechanically, his mind still processing the horrific revelation about Caroline's death. It hadn't been complications of childbirth that took her, but deliberate, prolonged poisoning orchestrated by Victor Ransom and executed by a man Gabriel had trusted. When the officials finally departed, Gabriel found Penelope in their bedroom, sitting quietly by the window. She looked up as he entered, her eyes filled with compassion. I'm so sorry, Gabriel, she said softly. About Caroline, about everything. He sank onto the edge of the bed, emotions finally breaking through the shock. I had no idea. All this time, I thought it was my fault that I hadn't gotten her proper care, that I'd failed to protect her. Penelope moved to sit beside him, taking his hand. It wasn't your fault, none of it was. I should have seen it. Decker was here in our home, serving her meals. His voice broke. And now he nearly succeeded again with you. But he didn't, she reminded him gently, placing his hand on her rounded abdomen where their child moved vigorously. We're both safe, and now we know the truth. Gabriel pulled her carefully into his embrace, allowing tears to fall freely for the first time in years, tears for Caroline and their lost child, tears of relief for Penelope's safety, tears of release from the guilt he had carried so long. "What about Victor Ransom?" Penelope asked eventually. Decker admitted he ordered Caroline's murder. Gabriel's expression hardened. "Marshal Caldwell is arranging for his arrest. Decker's confession and the letter in his possession should be enough to convict him." Justice, when it came, was swift and complete. Victor Ransom was arrested that same day. Faced with overwhelming evidence and abandoned by his few remaining allies, he confessed to orchestrating not only Caroline's murder, but also the schoolhouse fire and subsequent attacks on Sunrise Ranch. The judge sentenced him to hang, a sentence carried out 2 weeks later despite appeals for clemency from his estranged wife. The resolution of this long shadow over their lives allowed Gabriel and Penelope to focus fully on their future. As summer waned and Penelope's pregnancy advanced, Gabriel channeled his energy into preparing for their child's arrival. The nursery was completed, featuring a beautiful cradle Gabriel crafted himself and a rocking chair that had belonged to his mother, Dr. Simmons, true to his word, arranged to be in the vicinity as Penelope's due date approached. He took up temporary residence in Silver Creek during October, making regular visits to Sunrise Ranch to check on his patient's progress. "Everything appears excellent," he assured them during one such visit. "Mother and child both healthy and strong." Gabriel, though still harboring fears from his past experience, gradually allowed himself to embrace the joy of impending fatherhood. He read extensively from the childcare books he'd ordered, discussed names with Penelope for hours, and even practiced swaddling techniques on Mrs. Talbot's long-suffering cat. Penelope watched his transformation with loving amusement. "I believe you'll be a natural father," she told him one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "You've certainly prepared thoroughly enough," he smiled, his hand resting protectively on her belly. "I want to do everything right this time. We will," she promised, "together." Their daughter arrived on a crisp October morning after a remarkably straightforward labor. Dr. Simmons pronounced both mother and child perfectly healthy as he placed the squalling infant in Gabriel's trembling arms. "Meet your daughter, Mr. Hawkins," the doctor said with a smile. Gabriel gazed down at the tiny, red-faced bundle with awestruck wonder. "She's beautiful," he whispered. "Perfect." Penelope watched from the bed, exhausted but radiant. "What shall we name her?" They had discussed many possibilities over the preceding months but had not reached a final decision. Now, looking at their daughter's delicate features, Gabriel knew with certainty. "Hope," he suggested. "Hope Martha Hawkins." Tears of joy filled Penelope's eyes. "It's perfect." The years that followed brought the fulfillment of all they had dreamed during their courtship. Sunrise Ranch prospered under their joint stewardship, with Gabriel managing the cattle operation while Penelope oversaw the household and continued teaching. Her small schoolroom grew to accommodate 12 students, earning a reputation for excellence that drew families from considerable distances. Hope proved to be a strong, intelligent child with her father's quiet determination and her mother's love of learning. She was joined 2 years later by a brother, Thomas Gabriel, and eventually by twin girls, Elizabeth and Caroline, completing their family. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Gabriel surprised Penelope with a special gift, the deed to the original auction house where they had first met, now renovated into Silver Creek's first proper library. "From the moment you stumbled and I told you to stand, I knew you were someone extraordinary," he said as they stood before the building's new facade. "This seems a fitting commemoration of the day that changed everything." Penelope, her eyes bright with tears, squeezed his hand. "Who would have thought that public humiliation could lead to such happiness?" "I would," Gabriel replied, drawing her close. "The moment I saw you rise with dignity despite their laughter, I knew you were a woman of uncommon strength and grace. I'm grateful every day that I was there to witness it." As the sun set behind them, casting long shadows across the town they had both come to love, Penelope reflected on the remarkable journey from that auction day to this moment. What had begun with laughter at her expense had transformed into a life filled with love, purpose, and joy, all because a quiet rancher had the courage to stand against cruelty and offer his hand to a stumbling stranger. "Take me home, Gabriel," she said softly, linking her arm through his. "Our family is waiting." Hand in hand, they walked toward their waiting wagon, their steps perfectly matched after years of walking life's path together, the schoolteacher from Boston and the rancher who had claimed her heart in the wild western territory they now both called home.